you all the way live from Oakland, California. This is Revolution. And I'm on my way back to getting the better equipment I've had back. So big shout out to Gene and Kuba for helping me make just this much happen. So this show I'm playing right now, this is going to be the audio only podcast. This got taken down by YouTube. Now, a lot of the shows that I do, there's always some weird issue with the copyright. Sometimes it's me fighting with my own self. It sounds strange. All the music that you hear on this show is music that I've made at some point. Music I made with other groups, but I was one of the main songwriters, so I shouldn't even say group. The other group I was in was just me and my ex, so it was only two of us. And she is not complaining about copyrights. It's just an algorithm thing. So sometimes I'll have to fight copyright strikes on YouTube. Even Facebook recently, one of our shows on Facebook was taken down because Warner Brothers said I had taken some of their music, which I did not sample a goddamn thing. Anyway, this show in particular, which is, there's been some interesting, we did a Palestine show, which actually was up for the last audio podcast, and they wouldn't let me monetize that. YouTube just said, nope, you can't monetize this. And so this show that we did, that you're about to hear on the Turkish question with Professor Cihan Tugal, they took down altogether. I made a video clip of some news shows that Jean Bajlan had sent me, and I thought I did all I needed to do, and YouTube took the whole show down. One of the better shows that we did, actually. Pascal called me the following day, like, "Hey man, that was a really great show we did. Like, damn, I really liked that show." And I had to break the bad news to him, and he was not very happy. None of us are very happy when stuff like this happens. Granted, you can still see the show on Facebook and on Twitter. YouTube is where we get the majority of the views, and they just took the whole thing down. So it usually takes about a week or so before they go, "Oh, our bad," and release the holds, whatever the situation is. I have 2 more copyright strikes I'm waiting on that are literally songs where I played all the instruments that I've used for these shows or these clips. So right now, other than, like I said, if you wanted to see it, it's just Twitter and Facebook are the only places you can see it. And of course, there are links in the description wherever you're listening to this to the Facebook and the Facebook and the Twitter. Our Twitter is at TRI Show Oakland. You can see it. If you wanted to see it live on YouTube, well, you have to be a YouTube subscriber, and then you can catch the show while we're doing it, be a part of the show. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we do these live streams. Excuse me. And every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time, we do these live streams. So, youtube.com backslash youtube.com backslash this is Revolution Podcast. Watch it live. Be a part of the show. It's a great community that we have in the chat, I think. I'm being biased. I don't give a shit. So here is, without any further ado, I don't want to waste any more time because there are people that are pretty upset that this got taken down. Here is our show with Cihan Tugal, professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He recently wrote a great article in the New Left Review about the rise of Erdogan and the shift in the AKP, kind of a demographic breakdown of who are followers of the AKP. Just, I don't know, great article. There's links in the description of the show to all of the professor's work. I'm going to get out of the way so you can hear the show. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for all the patron subscribers. They get to hear the bonus after hours segment for these shows. If you were a patron, the after hours segment towards the end definitely was some comedy somehow, and I have no idea how the conversation devolved into furries, but Pascal learned what furries are. So if you're a patron, you can hear his surprise, to say the least, about furry culture. So this is our episode about Turkey with Professor Cihan Tugal. It is myself, my co-host, my homie, my dog, Pascal Robert, and also professor of Kurdish history, Cihan Bajlan. He is also part of the This is Revolution Thursday Foreign Policy Night. This is not a war. This is revolution, and I am out. Thank you. All right, welcome everybody to another Foreign Policy Thursday. I have two co-hosts today. It's a very special Foreign Policy Thursday. My co-host, my homie, my dog, coming all the way live from Miami, Florida, Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings, brother Jason Miles. Peace and greetings to the audience in the chat.
What it do. And also coming at you from the hood of Springfield, Missouri, Professor Cihan Bajlan.
Good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to be here, and I'm super excited about tonight's episode and tonight's guest, so I'm looking forward to a great show.
I'm actually pretty excited as well. I've actually was doing a lot of looking into Turkey because of the footage you sent me, Cihan, to help make this clip that I'm about to show. to get you guys kind of ready for what we're going to be talking about. I believe the show is called Turkey at a Crossroads. Here is a video that I made. Check it out. Let me know what you guys think.
Tayyip Erdogan, Prime Minister Tayyip to his supporters. But despite winning the recent election, one of the most charismatic and popular politicians in Turkey has never taken office, barred because of a previous conviction for incitement to religious hatred. With our team in the parliament, we will reward your trust and we will meet your expectations. No one need doubt us. Throughout the election campaign, the pragmatic and ambitious Erdogan steered clear of religious slogans and was careful to appease all sides. The star of the conservative Islamic Party for Justice and Development promised hope, progress and modernity. For a while, the situation was potentially explosive. The man who had been elected to lead the country was constitutionally unable to. But the accession to the premiership of his AKP deputy, Abdullah Gül, has proved to be more or less a figurehead. Despite the constitutional barrier to the top, Erdogan is the de facto leader of Turkey. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a very charismatic man who enjoys huge respect in the population. His personality played a large role in the election.
For the last 2 decades, Turkey has been ruled by the Justice and Development Party, better known by its Turkish acronym AKP, a political party with its origins in the country's Islamist movement. The rise of the AKP was a profound shock for the secular nationalist elite that had dominated Turkish political life since its foundation of the Republic of Turkey in the early 1920s. Initially, the AKP, under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, postured as a liberalizing force in Turkish politics, promising greater political freedom, an end to military tutelage, and a resolution to the Kurdish question and an improvement of relations with neighboring countries. However, over the last decade, the AKP and Erdogan have become increasingly authoritarian and repressive internally and aggressive abroad. What explains this transformation? What does it mean for the further of Turkey? And what does it mean for the broader Middle East and Balkans? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution. So let's not waste any more time. Let's bring in our guest. He is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He studies 3 interlocking dynamics: capitalism's generation and destruction of communities, livelihoods, and places, the implosion of representative democracy, the crisis of liberal ethics. His ongoing research focuses on populism, the radical right, and neoliberalism in the United States and the Middle East. He has also initiated a team project to study the ecological crisis of capitalism, with special emphasis on the role of labor and community struggles in developing sustainable energy. He is Cihan Tugal. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming on. We're really excited about today.
Very much so.
So I know Cihan has limited time with us today, so I thought we would, get straight to the questions. I'll sort of introduce a little bit. Cihan wrote a really interesting article talking about the AKP period in Turkey and the sort of various vicissitudes of Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party over the last 2 decades. It was published in New Left Review, which is one of the premier left-wing kind of semi-academic, semi-popular journals. And, I thought it was one of the most, one of the best pieces I've read. And I really recommend people who are interested in Turkey and understanding how Turkey has evolved over the last 2 decades, really take a look at it. And, that was one of the reasons I wanted to bring him on and wanted us to talk to him, was to sort of give us an idea about what exactly is going on in Turkey, how Turkey is its position is changing both in the Middle East and in world affairs, but also what are the internal dynamics shaping Turkey's politics, especially, the shift from an apparent liberal phase, in the 2000s to a more authoritarian phase in the in the last sort of 5-10 years. So, I think I'll hand it over to Pascal to sort of open up with some general questions. And, I gave Cihan some questions that I'd prepared earlier, so we can perhaps get to those, and hopefully we can have an enjoyable discussion.
Absolutely. Cihan, I really appreciate you being on the show. I think that one of the things that is difficult for those in the West who are not familiar with the Muslim world to understand is that what exactly is the historical significance of Turkey in the consciousness of the Islamic world in the Middle East relative to the Ottoman Empire, and why there's so much particular joy in the Sunni Muslim community with the rise of the Erdogan regime. Can you talk a little bit about what Turkey means from the period of the Ottoman Empire to the rise of the secular Gamal Ataturk to the Islamist movement of Erdogan, and how that transition could be seen as something significant to the Sunni Muslim world, and what causes particularly that kind of affection for the Erdogan project?
Thank you very much for that question. Thank you, Pascal, for that question. So, of course, my answer will have to be a little simplistic because this is a very long history. It's, hundreds of years, and it's also simplified in the consciousness of people. So the Ottoman Empire, it was the seat of the caliphate for centuries, from the early 16th century to the early 20th century, until Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, abolished both first the Ottoman Empire and then the caliphate. And the caliphate was not always welcomed in the larger Sunni world. The change of seat from Arab-based empires to a Turkish empire was not always welcomed, but except maybe in the minds of more secular Arabs and other Muslims, the Turkish or the Ottoman past has been identified simplistically with the glory of Sunni Islam and all of the ambiguities and all of the repression that the larger Sunni world has experienced at the hands of the Ottomans is sort of buried in that story. But what we know, or what most people know, is that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk has abolished the caliphate, and this is seen as a blow against Sunni Islam, at least among, again, as I'm saying, pious Sunni Muslims, not necessarily more, secularized ones. And the Erdogan project is seen as a kind of restoration of that Sunni Islamic glory, even though Erdogan and the people around him do not necessarily want to reestablish the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate in their fullness, but they are integrating many cultural themes from the Ottoman Empire and its past Sunni Islamic glory.
So is it safe to say that Erdogan is aware of this particular romanticization in the Muslim world and uses it strategically to his public relations advantage in that part of the world?
Well, yeah, definitely. This is a big part of the project. And in the first 10 years of the regime, this was implemented much more peacefully. So the foreign minister and the mastermind of the foreign policy of the AKP, Ahmet Davutoğlu, had this concept of strategic depth and zero problems with neighbors. What these meant was, at least in the Islamist, Sunni Islamist perception in Turkey, Kemalism was very isolated. The Kemalist Turkish Republic was very isolated, and it distrusted its neighbors, especially because of the heaviness of Sunni or Shia Islam in its neighbors. And now Ahmet Davutoğlu and the AKP were going to amend for this and establish peaceful relations with its neighbors. But the concept of strategic depth, it was even broader. It covered the whole Islamic world. And the idea was that Turkey, unlike the Ottoman Empire, was not going to influence these lands through conquest and military might, but through diplomacy, cultural influence, and business. Business was a very big part of this picture. So that was Ahmet Davutoğlu's vision until he was demoted and ultimately ousted from the party.
Another question, I don't, I want to defer to Gene as well soon, but one of the questions that fascinates me about your article in talking about how the Erdogan regime was able to play well into the machinations of the West and NATO, the EU and the US, particularly in such close proximity to the war on terror and 9/11. The AKP comes into power almost immediately after the September 11th kind of a terrorist attack. My question is that, what do you feel that the West's belief in the utility of Erdogan as an Islamist is an attempt to pivot away from dependence on the Gulf regimes as a stable kind of partner in ideological control in the Muslim world in the Middle East? Do you think it's a potential part of the narrative as to why they would even consider working with the Erdogan regime?
Yes, definitely. This is a very good summary of the, again, first 10 years, not the last 10 years, but the first 10 years of the AKP project was exactly this, Islamization under the umbrella of a NATO power. So under the umbrella of neoliberal globalization. So Turkish Islam was seen as an alternative, sometimes to especially jihadi Islam, sometimes to Iranian Islam, sometimes to Saudi Islam. But on all of these fronts, it was perceived as an alternative to either the West's direct enemies, such as the Iranian regime. Of course, I'm using all of these words in quotes. I don't see Iran as a direct enemy of the West, but from the perspective of neocons and neoliberals, that was the case. And the Turkish kind of Islam, like AKP's kind of Islam, was seen as a weapon against Iran, against Al-Qaeda, other jihadis, and also secondarily, even though the Saudis are not perceived as an enemy of the neocon project, there are always question marks about Saudis. And the AKP's version of Islam was seen as something more palatable to the liberal audiences in the Western world too, because especially center liberals, center conservatives, they're always disturbed by America's and Britain's cooperation with the Saudis. So here you have a more culturally, at least relatively more liberal Islam, but still in cooperation with Western empires. So that was the appeal for the Western imperialist powers.
And what is fascinating about your article is you talked about how that perceived dependence kind of falls apart somewhat, and Erdogan somewhat goes rogue, but not completely. If you want to, can you speak a bit about how the second decade period is different from the first 10 years, and what causes those particular fractures in the perception of Erdogan's, his being a dependable partner for the West?
Yeah, thank you, Pascal. That is a good question, but a big question. So maybe we'll open up some of the causes as we talk about other aspects of the AKP, because that transition is a huge transition and it has multiple causes. So I don't want to reduce it to one cause, but I can give a very broad map just to start off. So Erdogan has, at least internally, when speaking to domestic audiences, has completely switched. And when speaking to the EU and the US, he fluctuates. Okay, so he's not now saying I'm anti-NATO or anti-EU all the time when he's speaking to the West. He sometimes says those things. But when speaking domestically, not only Erdogan, but the people around him, they picture AKP's project as an anti-imperialist project. So that's a huge change of track, from this, pet project of the imperialists to an anti-imperialist power. It's a huge change, and it didn't happen overnight. And there are many, many causes of this. And what is being sold, of course, to domestic audiences is not entirely honest, because despite even anti-Semitism, the Turkish regime still has deep trade links with Israel and can be seen as one of the logistical supporters of Israel in the region, even though Erdogan is now seen as an anti-Israel hero in the Muslim world. So the trade links and many, many other institutional links with Israel, but more broadly with the EU and the US, these persist despite the rhetoric, despite the domestic rhetoric. The foreign rhetoric is, as I was saying, it's more ambiguous, and it fluctuates.
Gene, I'd like to I'll pivot to you for some questions if you'd like.
Sure. I would like to sort of begin actually by asking something particularly about the sort of spreading of Turkish influence overseas, especially in the first phase of AKP governance in Turkey. To what extent did the AKP actually benefit from sort of civil society expansion overseas, in particular the Fethullah Gülen movement, this kind of sort of Islamic civil society, Hizmet movement that isn't fully under state control or wasn't fully under state control? To what extent was that fostered by the AKP, or indeed there was a kind of more of an alliance? We know later on that the two sides kind of fell out, and now the Gülenists have been purged from Turkey. But to what extent did actually the AKP depend very much on Fethullah Gülen and his network around the world in places, across Africa and Asia? To what extent did they benefit from something they actually didn't create themselves, or were they central in sort of the expansion of the Gülen network around the world?
And define AKP for our audience again, if they don't know, if it's possible, please.
Define the Gülen movement or the AKP?
AKP.
The AKP is Justice and Development Party, which is now in power in Turkey. It has been in power for 19 years. And it started out as an Islamic liberal party, and now it's an Islamic nationalist party, basically. And the Gülen movement is something much older. And so it was not created by the AKP, but it was expanded and entrenched by the AKP. And the AKP, at least in its initial 10 years, depended very intensely on Gülen, especially in its relations to Washington, D.C. Even at more local levels to state capitals. So the Gülen movement is very strong in the United States, and it has very deep links with all levels of American government, both central and local. And the Gülen movement was also important for the AKP in its relations to the Turkish bureaucracy and military, because non-Gülen Islamists were hardly ever allowed into higher ranks of the bureaucracy. So before the AKP was the pet Islamic project of the imperialists, in the larger Muslim world, the Gülen movement was the primary pet project of imperialism. It was established in the 1970s, 1980s, became very strong in the 1980s after an anti-leftist and anti-Islamist military coup in 1980. So for the Turkish state and for the United States, the Gülen movement was seen as an alternative to all kinds of Islamism, especially but not only in Turkey and Central Asia. So they spread, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they were supported fully by all levels of American government and Turkish government, including, this anti-Islamist military junta in Turkey in 1980, and all the secular governments that followed the junta. So they always fought against Islamists, but they always supported Gülen. So the Gülen movement and the Islamists were really on bad terms, even though they are both seen as Islamists, but they are not exactly. So Islamist students, for example, when I was a student in college in Istanbul, Islamist students used to burn, literally burn Gülen's newspapers. They were hated that much. These students weren't burning leftist or liberal newspapers, they would burn Gülen's newspapers. And Gülen supported this anti-Islamist junta in 1980, and then another military intervention against just the Islamists this time in 1997. And Gülen was hoping to benefit from that military intervention, but for various reasons, that military intervention turned against Gülen, and his cadres started to be kicked out of Turkey. So it's at that point, after the 1997 coup, that the Islamists and the Gülenists started to cooperate, and it was to the benefit of both, because Gülen was all of a sudden persona non grata in Turkey, and it was only with the AKP coming to power that he could re-access the Turkish bureaucracy.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. Very helpful. So I want to.
Gene, you want to continue?
Go ahead. No, go ahead. If you had...
Because I know time is of the essence. If you can really move into the military geostrategic utility of Turkey and the Erdogan regime, particularly in the context of the contemporary issues in Syria, the relationship Turkey has with China, its pivoting role with Russia, and the overall geopolitics of the late stage of the war on terror, and how Turkey has been able to kind of dance between all of these various positions, yet still maintain its positionality in NATO. I know it's a complicated subject, but I'd really like you to kind of elaborate for us that aspect of Turkey's kind of geostrategic functionality, if you can.
Yes. The Arab Spring is also a pivotal moment here. So going back to your earlier question, Pascal, what caused this shift? The Arab Spring was one of the causes. So in the beginning of the Arab Spring, both the hope of Washington, D.C. and the hope of the Turkish government was that they would export this model, this liberal, neoliberal Islamism, quickly to Syria and Egypt and Tunisia and other places where uprisings took hold and were ready to topple governments. So Washington, D.C.'s thinking was, we're going to get rid of these dictators whom we were working with the exception of the Syrian dictator, and we're going to replace them with liberal Islamists, neoliberal Islamists. And the AKP was really key here because they had paved the way. They had created this more democratic, more neoliberal version of Islam, still following NATO. And as soon as, for example, the Egyptian dictator was toppled, the AKP started to invade Egypt with its businesses. So not with military, with businesses. So lots of businessmen were sent, lots of business relations were set up. So this project was going to take hold, but then everything fell apart in the Arab Spring. right? So if it was left to the votes in Syria and Egypt, it's very likely, maybe not Tunisia so much, because the left in Tunisia is very strong. But in Egypt and Syria, that was a very likely direction of the popular vote. So electing the Muslim Brotherhood into power. And the Muslim Brotherhood with some reservations, so that there's a little complexity there too, and I won't go into that, but with some reservations, they wanted to follow the AKP route, which seemed more realizable and more realistic to them in comparison to the 1970s, where they were closer to, like 1960s, where they were closer to an Islamic socialist understanding of the economy. But the Arab Spring basically, it's made all of these dreams collapse, basically, right? So after that, this Ahmet Davutoğlu, the mastermind of strategic depth, was basically ousted from the AKP, and more nationalist and conquest-driven people started to control foreign policy. And now, not with something as well-rounded or conceptual as strategic depth or zero problems, they just started to, send fighters, both military, but more so paramilitaries, to the region. And this includes Syria, this includes Libya, and Yemen was a part of their intentions, but Saudi Arabia is so strong in that region that the AKP could not influence what was happening in Yemen.
I would like to
go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to sort of shift focus a little bit to discuss about the domestic agenda, and I very much appreciate what you sort of the shifts in what you've talked about in terms of the shifts in AKP policy. And I always find the cosplay anti-imperialism that the Erdogan government engages in, and a lot of sort of sectors of the Turkish press engaged in, quite interesting, especially given the historical origins and the original sort of foreign policy posture of the AKP. Now suddenly, allying with all these, like you have Dobrenchek, now an ex-Maoist nationalist, is now sort of close with the government, along with these Eurasianists who fantasize about kind of reorienting Turkey, when in fact, economically and politically, Turkey still is tied to the EU, still is tied to Israel, and in fact cooperated with Israel in the recent Karabakh war as well, supporting Azerbaijan together. But I wanted to focus on the domestic agenda in terms of sort of your article, and sort of in your article, you use this concept of passive revolution to talk about Turkey under the AKP. And I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate to our audience what you mean precisely by a passive revolution. Why is this model applicable to the AKP? And is it something particularly new in Turkey? When I think of passive revolution, I think of the original passive revolution in Turkey as the Tanzimat and the Hamidian regime, and this as this is a kind of cyclical thing that sort of seems to happen in Turkey every so often. So I'd like you, maybe if you can, to kind of expand on that point.
Yeah, thank you, Gene. That's a very good question. So passive revolution is Antonio Gramsci's concept, and I use it in a very specific way. I see that it can be applied to Tanzimat, it can be applied to Kemalism. Some scholars have applied it to the Democratic Party of the 1950s. Some people have applied it to Özal. But my sense is very much more specific. So it's a restoration revolution, and the revolutionary component is very important. And what do we mean by the absorption of the revolution? That's very important. It's not just, taking one or two themes and policy ideas and a couple of institutional tactics from revolutionaries. It's the passive revolution is really an expensive use of revolutionary discourse and formerly revolutionary cadres. So this is very important, and this we don't see much in Tanzimat. But we do see it, for example, in Italian fascism. So that was one of Gramsci's initial inspirations for this concept. Italian fascists, most of them were formerly left-wing socialists. So they brought their organization, they brought their cadres and discourses and tactics into a far-right movement. So of course, we don't see the repetition of the same thing. So it's not that, like a fascist movement appropriated the socialist movement. That didn't happen in Turkey. The fascist movement and the socialist movement were quite separate and were at war with each other in the 1970s. And Islamists stayed outside of that war in the 1970s. And they were very much influenced by Sayyid Qutb. They were very much influenced by Ali Shariati and ultimately by the Iranian Revolution. So there was this idea that now with the Iranian Revolution, we're no longer the stooges of America. We're no longer, this extension of America against the Soviets in this region. We are against both the Soviet Union and we are against the American empire. So we're going to overthrow all of these imperialist capitalist powers in the region. And of course, I'm not saying, that this thinking characterized most Islamists, but it did characterize the most dynamic Islamists at the end of the 1970s. And the AKP's original cadres, those who broke off from the Islamist movement, are mostly from this revolutionary milieu of the late 1970s and 1980s, and they turned their revolutionary weapons and fervor against the regime as they promised, but they also used to restore American empire and capitalism in Turkey and elsewhere, as I was pointing out. So that's the restoration bit. And the revolutionary bit is that they did really fight the Kemalist bureaucracy and Kemalist military, at least up until 2015 or so. Now things are getting much more complicated because of reasons we can come to. But from 2002 to 2015, there was this really revolutionary attempt against the Kemalist bureaucracy and Kemalist military while restoring capitalism and imperialism in the region. And that's why I'm using this revolution restoration framework.
I really appreciate that you point out 2015 and the 2015 election as being this critical turning point, because that's been my general perception. People have looked to the coup in 2016, but the failed coup in 2016 seemed to have merely accelerated an ongoing, a trend, a shift away from kind of the liberal phase, which kind of died in 2015 with the sort of failure of the AKP to maintain its majority, and then the shenanigans with the second election. So I kind of appreciate that take, because people are often sort of overawed by the coup when in fact sort of the death knell was a year earlier. So I kind of wanted to move on to a sort of another question I had, which was about the class composition of the AKP. What precisely, from a kind of Marxian perspective, and I am assuming since you're publishing a New Left review and using Gramscian terminology, you tend to see yourself within the family of Marxism. I just wanted to ask your thoughts perhaps on the class composition of the AKP and why it has been able to forge, in Gramscian terms, a kind of a historic bloc that has been able to maintain power in a way that sort of no other regime I can think of in Turkish history has. You could say the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi did something similar, but they used the kind of authoritarian methods of the 1920s and 30s to maintain power. İttihat ve Terakki, the Committee of Union and Progress, is perhaps the closest approximation in my mind of the kind of ideological and sort of political orientation, and I think sort of the rehabilitation of Committee on Union and Progress figures such as Talat Pasha in public life, in sort of the public memory in Turkey kind of pointed out. But yeah, why do you think the AKP has been so effective compared to other political parties in Turkey's history? Because, multi-party democracy is, over half a century old in Turkey.
Cihan, thank you very much. But there are at least 5 or 10 questions there, so I don't know which to answer. But
I was going to read a part of your essay to kind of to lead you into that, but Gene kept going and just shut me up. So
I apologize, Jason. Go
ahead and answer his 18-part question. So
I have so many questions. Yeah.
You know why? You know why, Professor? It's because you told us you had a limited amount of time. And so you're asking like really, really smart guys that have a million questions to ask you to get it all done in like 45 minutes.
No, I appreciate all of these questions. I was just kidding. I really appreciate this. Thank you. So, oh, you're not reading, so I am answering. Okay, so yeah, let me begin answering.
well, you okay? This is what you wrote in the New Left Review.
Okay,
can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. The initial appeal of the AKP as a voice for ordinary patriotic Muslims, long denied recognition by Turkey's secular elites, was primarily to provincial business owners and I'm gonna excuse me if I say this wrong. Anatolian heartlands and the conservative petty bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm.
But around this social core, the Erdoganists constructed a much broader hegemonic bloc. Its cadre included the shadowy network of believers run by the cleric Fethullah Gulen, with extensive influence among the police. It also spoke to the millions driven off the land by cuts to agricultural subsidies or the forced clearances of the Kurdish southeast, and hurled pell-mell into precarious proletarization on the outskirts of the big cities, where the mosque and its school offered a chance of order and advancement amidst the chaos of urban life. Something like this was Erdogan's own story, positioning itself as a new model Muslim party, an Eastern equivalent of Christian democracy, pro-market, pro-NATO, pro-EU. The AKP also won the support of many Turkish Kurds and most of the left liberal intelligentsia, who saw it as an expression of civil society against the authoritarian state and the best hope for EU entry. Jean also had given me a video to watch around the time Erdogan was elected initially in 2002. So when he asked about the class composition of the followers, would you say they're mostly of the petty bourgeoisie and the like?
Well, yes, but as you just read, much broader than that, right? Squatters, proletarianized peasants, provincial bourgeoisie, not just petty bourgeoisie. I mean, these upwardly mobile and no longer provincial. We should call them just ex-provincial. Provincial bourgeoisie was very important in the Islamist movement, but now they are, so many of them are among the 100 richest companies in Turkey. And then a lot of intellectuals, and then in its initial first 10 years, lots of leftist support, including some Marxists, and also a lot of people who are shy to admit or never admitted, but it was speculated that many secular professionals and business families were also voting for the AKP, because otherwise market capitalism was not getting stabilized. With bringing in this Islamic fervor against the military into the middle of the neoliberalizing project, they garnered all of this popular enthusiasm for neoliberalism. So we always think of neoliberalism as something, against the people, attacking people, exploiting people. Well, that is right at many levels, but the important thing is that they garnered Islamic enthusiasm and like anti-military enthusiasm for all of this.
And it was a period, and this is something I would know personally. I lived in Turkey between 2005 and 2011, so the golden age, and there was real gains for elements of the population, and for at least for a certain period of time, there was certain optimism about this. And I think this is quite striking. And you indicated it. Many liberals, liberals and Marxists, sort of came in line behind what was in essence a neoliberal Islamist political party. Can you explain a little bit of the context of why the liberal / left intelligentsia, the professor, the academia, why so many were willing to go along with the AKP project, at least until about 2012, even maybe 2011, 2012, when things started to go south. Why did they sort of sign on to the project?
Yeah, so we have mentioned some aspects of this and left out a big aspect. So the part we mentioned was the anti-military fervor. So the military is not hurting just, or was not just hurting pious Muslims, it was hurting many people in Turkey. So that was one thing. The pro-EU stance of the AKP was another reason. But what we have not talked about at length is the Kurdish issue. So center left, center right, far right, they had all squandered every opportunity to resolve the Kurdish issue. The far right and the center right were not repressive enough, or not smartly repressive. The center left was not democratic enough. So the Kurdish problem got deeper and deeper in Turkey, and the war got worse and worse. And there was this glimmer of hope in the mainstream when the Kurdish guerrilla leader was arrested. And on the heels of that, there was like a far-right, center-left, center-right coalition that came to power in 1919. So that was the peak of Turkish nationalist hope. Oh, we got rid of them. But this was by no means realistic. This is a very popular movement, and this is what the mainstream could never understand or accept. I mean, it's not difficult to understand, but it is difficult to accept from a nationalist point of view that a minority movement can get so strong. And yeah, despite the leader being arrested, the movement kept being organized or organizing further and in other venues, etc. And it is at this point that the AKP said, we are going to resolve this through Islam. We are brothers and sisters in Islam, and also we are liberals. So we are going to implement all of the reforms that the liberal Western world has been calling for as regards the Kurdish issue. So the AKP promised this, but never implemented it because, there are many reasons, but one very strong reason being their nationalist roots as well. So covering it as an Islamist party, but pure Islamism never became too strong in Turkey. So it was always melded with Turkish nationalism. And the AKP never gave up never questioned its Turkish nationalist roots. So it always had these doubts about, giving too much grounds or giving too much freedom to the Kurds. So, it took 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 3 steps forward, 5 steps back. So it could, ultimately not resolve the Kurdish issue. But yeah, in its first 9-10 years, that's what liberals and Marxists, or some, not all, not the majority of Marxists, but the most intellectual and most influential Marxists in Turkey, they thought the AKP was going in that direction.
And of course, the AKP was able to build extremely good relations with Iraqi Kurdistan during this period as well. So they may not have resolved their internal issue, but they basically were able to transform Iraqi Kurdistan into a Turkish economic colony. And they maintain extremely good strategic relations with the Barzani and Talabani family that control that region, which is a kind of interesting sort of outgrowth of, because of course the Iraqi Kurds are probably more hostile to the PKK and the Kurdish movement in Turkey than the Turkish government is at times. So I kind of wanted to move on to basically a very sort of general question, since time is running out. What changed? I know that's very broad, but so we have this liberal phase that you've outlined very clearly, where you have this marriage of kind of the energy of political Islam. You have this sort of liberalizing political force, but liberalizing economic force. What are the factors that lead to the breakdown of this first formulation of AKP power and the kind of shift away from this liberal phase to increasingly relying on the National Action Party, the fascists, and sort of nationalist sectors, and also a kind of détente with certain elements within the military, as well as the kind of weird Türk Solu, the Turkish sort of nationalist, Marxist, weird left groups as well. What are the kind of basic forces that led to that realignment inside Turkish politics?
Yeah, that's very important. We shouldn't skip that. So it can't be emphasized enough. 2015 was really a huge turning point. So the further rise of the Kurdish movement and the AKP's panic. I mean, if we don't mobilize Kemalists these ultra-nationalist leftists and the Nationalist Action Party now, we can lose this country. I mean, that was a nationalist panic. So they made their peace with the secularist Kemalist generals, whom they had all liquidated. The AKP itself had liquidated between 2007 2010. So I mean, these people were tortured. They were fired. I mean, it was horrible from their point of view, horrible. And all of these people were now reintegrated into the regime so that they could fight the Kurds. And going one step beyond that, as you were pointing out, it was not just some ultra-nationalist leftists. It was Doğu Perinçek, this Maoist nationalist himself. He's like a huge, important, not huge in terms of size, but in terms of its links to intelligence services and to China. So this Chinese influence was all of a sudden, the Perinçek had fought to be included in the intelligence community for decades and failed. And now all of a sudden an Islamist welcomes this Maoist into the intelligence services, into the military, into all aspects of power to be able to fight the Kurds, and after 2016, Gülen. So, that's the other important component here. So losing Gülen meant you need other props within the old regime and then outside of the old regime. So that's why all of these forces are being combined now. The fascists of the Nationalist Action Party, the Maoists, and many hardliner generals that the AKP itself has had liquidated. So, the rise of the Kurdish movement is or the further rise, I should say, of the Kurdish movement is one big component here. The other big component is the world economic crisis, which actually partially worked to AKP's benefit for maybe 4 or 5 years, because there was all this hot cash escaping the United States and Britain and Europe and going to emergent markets, not just Turkey, but other emergent markets too. And after 2013, step by step, this hot cash started to flow back to the Western world because of the American Fed's change of heart. And that's really both changes, actually, this sudden flow of cash and the sudden withdrawal, they both upset the Washington consensus kind of smooth neoliberalism. So the AKP had to get more experimental with neoliberalism, and then it had to integrate more and more state capitalism. So not many non-neoliberal tools, maybe starting right after 2008, but definitely much more so after 2013. So now the central bank is no longer autonomous. I mean, that's one very big part of neoliberalism. I mean, you cannot have a politically completely manipulated central bank and neoliberalism, and those two things don't go together. So in some senses, the regime is still neoliberal in that it privatizes, it commodifies everything, but it does so basically with political purposes, not market-driven, not central bank-driven purposes.
I really wanted to I wanted to pivot into the political economy of Turkey, which is not particularly a natural resource-rich country, how does neoliberalism function in Turkey in a way that allows it to maintain legitimacy for the AKP without all of the traditional pauperization, if you will, that causes neoliberalism to be despised in the rest of the global South, Latin America, South America, so on and so forth? Is that simply because it's constantly being pumped in with cash because of global quantitative easing? What exactly is the secret sauce that allows the Turkish neoliberal model to give Erdogan the ability to maintain control?
Yeah, up until 2013 at least. As I'm saying, it's not as much neoliberal right now. But why was it so strong before? And that's a very good question. It's partially because of the hot cash and the way it is used. So, I mean, you can take hot cash and just fill the pockets of the people at the top. But they didn't do that. They actually used it as a household credit and mortgage credit for poor, middle class, upper middle class, all kinds of classes. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was a very targeted welfare regime. And this was actually not something the AKP devised. It was an idea of the World Bank itself. And Kemal Dervish, a center-left, quote-unquote center-leftist from the World Bank, actually started to implement this before the AKP came into power, but he didn't finalize it. So it was the AKP that finalized it. So there was more and more welfare after 2002, but in a very targeted way, not the welfare of the New Deal or of European social democracy in the 1960s, very targeted welfare of the Clinton type. So it's so targeted that they ultimately could control who it is going to, and that was used to create a very loyal base for the regime. So that was the so-called embedded neoliberalism that functioned really well up until the early 2010s. And now there are a lot of state capitalist tools being used. The state is building now, or Turkish capital, but heavily guided by the state, is trying to build Turkish cars, Turkish buses, Turkish tanks,
drones.
Turkish drones, exactly. The son-in-law of the president, actually. So it's very much family capital, but still statist capital that is driving forth all of this. So that a component of the economy is no longer neoliberal, even though the broader economy is still neoliberal.
Sort of as a kind of concluding question, because we're kind of running out of time. So in your article, we've talked about this kind of nationalist turn, this shift away from pure neoliberalism and so on and so forth. Now you make the point that political projects like David Olu's thing and Babacan's political parties, that's kind of like romanticizing the liberal era and trying to return to the early phase of AKP government and this like sort of golden age. You say that's not feasible. So what do you see as the future of Turkey? We've seen polls recently showing that Erdogan's popularity against theoretical matchups is not great. We have this whole mafia nonsense that's going on and sort of discrediting the government. So it looks like the AKP is a lot weaker in a political sense than it has been at any time in its history. But is there any hope for the future? Is Turkish democracy now too managed to actually have a transition of power? And if there is, what does the opposition offer? Is there any substantial difference between beyond the left wing and the Kurdish movement, which is now effectively excluded from Turkish politics? What do opposition parties like the E Party and the CHP offer that is substantially different from Erdoganism, but perhaps with a different face?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the question. So, yeah, I think this should be the final question because it wraps everything up. The opposition is so impoverished in its imagination. So these four main parties, CHP, E Party, which is an offshoot of the fascist party, and then two offshoots of the AKP, Gelecek and Deva parties. They all of them promise the same thing, and it is the first phase of the AKP. And this is so unrealistic. I mean, this is like a joke. The whole world is changed. You can't do this anymore. So the hot cash isn't there. The EU isn't there. I mean, the EU has all but evaporated. So the diplomatic balances are gone. The economic balances are gone. You can't do the same thing. But these four parties are exactly promising nothing but the first phase of the AKP. So if it is possible that the AKP might lose an election, but they would fight it. So I think that's the more likely scenario. I think that there will be a lot of fraud and possibly something something bordering a civil war. They would prevent any peaceful transfer of power if they can. That's the first thing they're going to try. But let's say the ideal scenario, there are elections and they lose, and a coalition of these four parties comes to power. What happens? They would really dynamite Turkey's future. It would be worse. And I think following them, there would be a stronger right-wing option if the right is able to reorganize itself. So a more clearly state capitalist push from the right would completely destroy Turkey's future. So I think that's another possible scenario. And I think, unlike the American right, for example, which wasted that chance, the Turkish right has the potential to do this. It's more ideologically prepared. It's more organizationally, politically prepared, very much unlike the American right. So they can really push Turkey in a fascist direction if such a retrial of the first phase of the AKP fails and feeds into fascist hopes. So then there's my ideal scenario, but it's not in the horizon right now, where the left and the Kurds pull themselves together and they devise a project that can speak to more than 50% of Turkey, something very clearly hegemonic in a way that the left has not been able to do so far in Turkey.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Professor Tugal.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate all of these questions. I couldn't answer all of them, but I appreciated all of them.
Well, that just means we have to have you back.
Okay.
If you're down to come back, we'd love to have you back.
Yeah, we really enjoyed having you on. Thank you so much for coming. And we have a link to your article, so people watching can take a look. And I really recommend that everybody has a look at it. Pascal read it today, and I think he enjoyed it too.
This was a very important conversation for a country that is very misunderstood, not understood in the West, has a great historical significance, and I'm very glad we were able to touch on all these parts today. Professor Tugal, thank you so much for your commentary.
And before you go, are you happy about the football result?
Well, some people in my family are, some people aren't.
What league is going on right now?
Oh, well, the Besiktas won the championship.
Yeah.
There's three big football teams in Turkey. There's only three football teams that matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, my favorite football team in Turkey is Diyarbakırspor, but
Ahmetspor.
but Besiktas are pretty cool too. They have the fun fan base. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful, and we hope.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you, Jason.
There's links in the chat, you guys, to the professor's article that he wrote in the New Left Review. There's also links to his book as well in the description of the show. Thank you once again, Professor, and have a good rest of your evening.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
All right.
All right, that was Professor Cihan Tugal. Did I say it right? Jean?
Tugal, yep.
Okay. See?
You did it. You did it.
You should. I was up till I didn't sleep, but I was trying to say Erdogan's whole name, and I would have to say it. I would say the last name. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to struggle through this shit, and I'm going to say it as best I can.
Well, there's a little trick in Turkish. All the C's are J's, right? And when you see that G with a hat on it, it just makes the vowel before it long, but it's super confusing. That G is originally a letter in Arabic called Gain. So if you hear an Arab pronouncing Erdogan, they would say Erdogan. Or if you hear someone Ran, yeah. So if you go to Azerbaijan, they say that letter, but in Turkish it's called a yumuşak G, a soft G. So it's kind of quiet. Anyway, a little bit of Turkish language for everybody.
So shout out to moderator John Ross that was helping us be troll free in the chat today. I appreciate that. Of course, appreciate everybody checking the show out. If you are a patron, we will be going into the bonus after hours segment very shortly. Me, Jean, and Pascal. I saw Derek Varn was in the chat. I would love to nudge him, but I know he's enjoying his time off. He's coming on the show anyway, sooner than later. And Pascal and I are going on his show. Also, some things are going to be changing for the better with this show as the show is growing. We're trying to add more features. And one of the features that's coming, hopefully within the next week, is a call-in feature. You guys are going to be able to call in and we can talk to y'all. I'm hella excited for it. And also movie night is still happening. I want to bang heads with Pascal and Jean about what movie I want to watch for this next movie night and some more patron-only programming that we've been working on doing. So great things are happening with the show. Thank you guys very much for checking it out. Again, thank you for the professor. And we are out. See you in the after.